By Sri Lanka's best internet package for online learning and online working with many amazing offers. Call 1212 for more information. Sri Lanka Telecom.
ලෙන්ගතුකම වැඩි කරගන්න ලව්ජු රුපියල් 50ට අඩු කළා.
මාමේ එන්න අපිට එකක් බොමු.
Tonight, voting for change. Polling in the largely peaceful, controversy-free general election closes as the nation awaits the final word. Picking the weed. Election monitors have their say on the historic polls.
Campaign finance. No election ought to be won by those with the largest number of resources.
Around 4,200 cases reported during this period. They try to do their propaganda activities through the social media.
End of the line. Notorious criminal SF Lokka murdered. All that and much more coming up on First at 9. This Wednesday, the 5th of August, 2020.
Nava Sunlight Sakura. Then Dikukal Pavatina Sakura Mal Suandin.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to First at 9. I'm Dhamke Kanayaka. The general election to elect 225 members for the 9th Parliament of the Socialist Democratic Republic of Sri Lanka was held today. The voting process, which lasted for 10 hours, was held in accordance with health guidelines, bearing in mind that the election is being held amidst a global virus pandemic. By the close of polls, the voter turnout in many districts exceeded 70%. The lowest percentage was reported from the Kurunegala and Puttlam districts, with just 65% and 64% of voters respectively turning out to exercise their franchise. The country's overall voter turnout was recorded at 71%.
Voting to elect 225 members to the 9th Parliament of the Socialist Democratic Republic of Sri Lanka commenced at 7 am today. 7,452 candidates from 20 recognized political parties as well as 34 independent groups contested in 22 electoral districts during this year's polls. According to the 2019 electoral list, the total number of voters eligible to cast their votes this time around was 16,263,885. Members of the public were provided with the opportunity to cast their vote at 12,985 polling stations island-wide. With the general election being held amidst a global pandemic, voters were given the opportunity to cast their ballots today in accordance with special health guidelines. Accordingly, it was made a must for voters to wear a face mask when arriving at the polling centres, and they were also advised to maintain the mandatory social distancing regulations. For those who had been in self-quarantine at their homes for an additional 14 days following the conclusion of their quarantine processes, they were given the opportunity to cast their votes from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. today. As planned, the voting process came to a conclusion at 5 this evening.
After 10 hours of voting today, voting ended at 5 p.m. this evening, where 19 Colombo district candidates will be elected to Parliament. The national importance of this election cannot be stressed enough, because after years of political instability, the country now has a chance to elect a government with a majority that can, for the next 5 years, instill some sense of stability to this country and bring some sort of economic relief. Ballot boxes have been streaming into Royal College, Colombo, one of the main counting centres in the district, since 5 o'clock. And counting will begin at 7 a.m. tomorrow, with the first results expected to come out at 3 p.m. tomorrow afternoon.
Out of the total number of 1,709,209 voters in the Colombo district, 70% turned out to cast their ballots today. The Gampaha district, which counts the highest number of voters with 1,785,964, recorded a voter turnout of 68%. The total number of voters who turned out to vote in the Kalutara district was 70% out of the 972,319 registered voters eligible to cast their votes. 1,129,100 voters in the Kandy district were eligible to vote in this year's general election, out of which 72% cast their ballots today. Out of the 407,569 members of the public eligible to cast their vote in the Mathare district, only 72% did so today. In the Novara Elia district, 75% turned out to cast their vote out of the 577,717 eligible voters. The number of voters eligible to vote in the Gaul district amounted to 867,709 and 70% of them were utilised today. Meanwhile, in the Mathare district, 71% of its voters cast their ballots today out of the 659,587 eligible voters. Out of a total of 493,192 eligible voters in the Hambantota district, 76% cast their ballots today. Hambantota is among the districts with the highest voter turnout. Meanwhile, the total number of eligible voters in the Kurunegala district amounts to 1,348,787 and of it, only 65% cast their votes today. Meanwhile, out of the total 614,370 eligible voters in the Puttalam district, the voter turnout was recorded at 64%. The Anuradhapura district recorded a voter turnout of 70% out of 693,634 eligible voters. Out of 391,119 voters in the Polonnaruwa district, 72% turned out at the polling stations today. Further, out of the total 668,166 eligible voters in the Badula district, 74% did so today. Meanwhile, the total number of voters in the Monaragala district amounted to 372,555, out of which 75% turned out at polling stations to vote. The voter turnout in the Ratnapura district was 71% out of 877,582 eligible voters. Meanwhile, out of 684,189 eligible voters in the Kegaul district, 70% of them cast their votes today. Meanwhile, in the Jaffna district, 67% of 571,848 eligible voters turned out to cast their votes today. The Wani electorate, which comprises of 3 administrative districts, has the lowest number of eligible voters. With that, 73% of its voters in the district cast their ballots today. Meanwhile, consisting of 288,868 eligible voters, the Trincomalee district recorded a voter turnout percentage of 73%. In the Batiklo district, 76% of its voters turned out at polling stations to cast votes for their preferred candidates. Meanwhile, out of the 513,979 eligible voters in the Digamandula district, 72% turned out to cast their ballots.
In the meantime, the head of state and leaders of prominent political parties also cast their vote today and revealed their expectations to media. All of them were hopeful of a positive outcome in the polls.
President Gotabaya Rajapaksa and the First Lady cast their vote at the general election 2020 at the polling station set up at the Vivekarama temple in Pangirivatta of Mirihanam. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa cast his vote at the DA Rajapaksa College in Madamulanam. Leader of the United National Party and former Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, in the meantime, exercised his franchise this morning at the polling station established at the University of Colombo.
I'm බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා ජනතාව අපිට වරමක් ලැබලා දෙයි කියලා. ඊතර බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවද ඔබතුමාලා? ආණ්ඩුවක් හදන්න පුළුවන් ඇති අපි තුනෙන් දෙයක් ඉල්ලන්නේ.
Leader of the Samagi Janabalawegaya, Sajith Premadasa, cast his vote at the polling station located in the Suranimala Junior School in Veeravilla. Leader of the Jathika Janabalawegaya, Anurukumara Dissanayaka, also cast his vote today at his designated polling station at the Abhay Singha Temple in Maligavatta. Given that this year's general election is worked off under the cloud of COVID-19, there had been some concern, especially on the part of the elderly, over the safety in visiting polling stations. Chairman of the Election Commission, Mahinda Deshapriya, who is in his 60s, took to his designated polling station at the Lindsay Girls' School in Kolpiti with the intention of dispelling any fears senior citizens might harbour in frequenting the polling stations.
2011 පස්සේ ඡන්ද 10කෙක් හැටියට ඡන්ද පොළට ගියාද? මොකද මට ඕන වෙලා තිබුණා. අවුරුදු 65ක් වෙලත් වයස ප්‍රශ්නයක් නැහැ. ඡන්ද පොළ සුරක්ෂිතයි. බය නැතුව ඡන්ද දාන්න එන්න. ඡන්දය ඔබේ අයිතියයි. ඔබේ හඬයි. ඔබේ අනාගතයයි. ඔබේ බලයයි.
In the meantime, registered voters in the Colombo electoral district were out in force to exercise their franchise. In the Gampaha district, where most eligible voters hail in this year's general election, voters called on at the polling stations were in line with the health and safety guidelines put in place to curb the spread of the COVID-19. The candidates contesting in the general election from the Kandy district also cast their vote in their respective polling stations. Parliamentary hopefuls from the one electoral district were also at their respective polling stations to exercise their franchise. In the Trincomalee electoral district too, general election candidates were seen casting their vote. The situation in the Jaffna electoral district was no different.
Enjoy a very smooth shave with the Bic Easy 2 razor. Bic Easy 2.
Chairman of the Election Commission Mahinda Deshapre is elated with the turnout at polling stations today, especially given the fact that the polls were worked off in the backdrop of the coronavirus pandemic. Addressing the media briefing after the voting closed, Deshapre also considered that health and safety procedures he promised to put in place to prevent any spread of the virus from polling stations may not have been implemented at several centres. He, however, said that his good mood meant that there weren't any major issues in the voting process of the general election 2020.
අපි තාම සතුටු වෙනවා එකෙන් ඔබට තේරෙනවා අපේ ඡන්ද විමසීමේ බරපතල ගැටලු ඡන්ද විමසීම ඇනල් කිරීමට තරම් වන හේතු මේ වන තෙක් කිසිවක් වාර්තා වෙලා නැහැ කියලා. අපි ඡන්ද 70%ක් පාවිච්චි කළා. 1 කෝටි දශලක්ෂයක් නැත්නම් 15 ලක්ෂයක් විතර වගේ ඡන්දේ දාන්න පැමිණුණු බව තමයි අපිට පේන්නේ. අනිත් සිද්ධිය අද දාලා තිබුණා මට පෙන්නුවා අපේ වෛද්‍ය මිතුරෙක් අපිත් එක්ක ඉන තාක්ෂණ කමිටුවේ ඡන්ද පොලේ මැකෝ කියපු තරම් කැටයක් නැහැ නේ බං. සැනිටයිසර් නැහැ අත්පීනේව නැහැ කියන තරම් කැටයක් නැහැ නේ බං. නැවතත් දාලා. ඒත් කැටයන් අවශ්‍ය ප්‍රමාණය තිබුණා. සමහර තැන්වල කැටේම හරියට කෙටිලා නැතිව තියෙන්න පුළුවන්. නමුත් ඒකට දාපු කමෙන්ට් වලින් අපි සතුටු වෙනවා හැකිතාක් දුරට ඒ කටයුතු කොරෝනා පැතිරීම වැළැක්වීමට පවත්වා ගැනීමට හැකියම ගැන. කොවිඩ් තත්ත්වය දීර්ඝ කලක් දවස් 150කට වඩා වැඩි කාලයක් ඡන්ද විමසීමක් තියෙද්දි 70%ක් ඡන්ද පොළට ආවයි කියන්නේ ලෝකේ මොනම තත්ත්වයක් පැටදෙව්වත් මේ වගේ තත්ත්වයක් ඒවා 100%ක් ඡන්ද පොළට ආවා වගේ.
In the meantime, Executive Director of the People's Action for Free and Fair Elections, Rohana Hettiarachchi, says none of the violations reported today were serious and called on candidates and supporters alike to avoid gathering in groups to celebrate. Meanwhile, co-convener of the Centre for Monitoring Election Violence, Dr. Pakisoti Saravanamuthu, said that a closer look must be taken at campaign spending by candidates, adding that victory should not be guaranteed by the wielding of resources alone.
There have been some incidents of violence and malpractice, but not of a great nature, and certainly none that would appear on the face of it to affect the result. The question of campaign finance. It's extremely important to stress that no election ought to be won by those with the largest number of resources. And as our investigations have concluded, the estimations of results indicate millions of rupees are spent by each candidate and by each party as far as the election is concerned. Apart from that, of course, the concerns have been with the turnout. Most people, I think, assumed that it would be a low turnout on account of the COVID virus. But what I want to emphasize, though, is that I think if as much or more for the reason for a low turnout is the general disillusionment of the voting public with the political parties and the available choices before them. An indictment, in a sense, on the nature of our democracy. And I think all politicians and aspiring politicians need to look at it and need to understand that the public at large expects certain standards.
In the meantime, Executive Director of the People's Action for Free and Fair Elections, Rohana Hettiarachchi, told First at 9 that they had recorded around 4,000 election violations that had taken place on social media, mainly on Facebook, and that they were able to remove around 50% of the advertisements.
There are two set of violations we have monitored. One is the social media violations. Around 4,200 cases reported during this period. The candidate did not consider the elections law and they try to do their propaganda activities through the social media, especially the Facebook. Actually, we inform the Elections Commission every hour. More than 50% of the advertisement we were able to remove from the Facebook. The second area which we monitored in a normal monitoring mechanism, there are I think 4 instances we have reported the candidate and candidate supporters were trying to distribute money to the voters. And one incident during cooling period, the violence take place in Colombo and I think 2 people admitted to the hospital also. But throughout the cooling period, most of the area illegal propaganda took place. The candidates were trying to organize a meeting, some dinner, some religious activities during this period. So those are the things which you have noticed during cooling period. Today we have reported around 100 cases, but there's no serious violence or violation as such. Illegal propaganda took place most of the places. Candidates supporters were trying to distribute some leaflet outside the polling stations. There are 2 occasions we have reported transport of the voters, and there were 2, one in Kurunagala, Nikavarati area and one in Akarepattu, vehicle parade during elections period we have noticed. But other than that, there are I think 2 occasions the voters after they casting their ballot try to get the pictures of the ballot papers, and other than that there was no serious violence as such. I think up to now the elections went in a peaceful manner.
He further went on to urge voters and candidates to not gather people in celebration for the next 2 weeks as it might incite violence.
We wish to appeal again all the winning candidates and the losing candidate as well as the entire voters. Don't organize any activities, any celebrations within next 2 weeks period, because it might help maybe the violence in the areas. Whoever win these elections, don't try to gather the people in one place because it can create a problem.
As polling came to an end this evening and the country waits with bated breath for the final say on who will take the country forward for the next 5 years, we at AdaDerana look forward to bringing you all the latest news and results in an informative and innovative digital experience.
As the country's most trusted news brand, we brought to you information about the entire voting process of the general election, starting from the very moment the polling stations opened this morning.
අද දිවයිනට හිරු උදාවන්නේ මෙරට දේශපාලන වංශ කතාවේ තවත් සුවිශේෂී සම්දිස්ථානයක් සනිටුවන් කරන දිනයකට ආරම්භය ලබා දෙමින්.
Your voice, your vote. Vote wisely and vote right. Welcome to Sri Lanka Decides, AdaDerana's coverage on 2020 general election as we bring you the very latest on manifestations with regard to the election.
Remember, you can vote till 5 p.m, but it is best that you get out and about and vote as quickly as possible.
We are at Christchurch in Mutwal, where the queues seem to be getting longer and longer as voters rush to the polling booths to get their votes in before the 5 o'clock deadline.
The AdaDerana production teams, along with the most reliable and fastest divisional media network, are already stationed across the country to bring our viewers updates from every corner of the island. With the use of state-of-the-art technology, our audience can indulge in a world-class television experience from their living room. Our viewers will be able to witness the revolutionary experience of election broadcasting on TV Derana, and the live telecast is also available on AdaDerana 24 on channel number 14 of both Pure TV and Dialogue TV. Without being restricted to the television alone, our media network will continue to provide election results via FM Derana, our website www.adaderana.lk, as well as through the AdaDerana SMS service. Be sure to tune in, as we will also bring you necessary election-related information via Facebook, YouTube and Twitter.
We will see you shortly. Stay tuned.
Ceylon Bank, the bank with a heart.
Welcome back. You're watching First at 9. Now, criminal gang member Iran Ranasinghe alias SF Lokka was murdered today by two unidentified assailants on a motorcycle. They had shot him multiple times, and SF Lokka had died on the way to hospital. He was also the chief suspect in the 2015 murder of former karate champion and multiple Guinness World Record holder Vasantha Soiza.
The shooting had happened at around 11:45 this morning near the level crossing at the Dahaya junction in Anuradhapura. At the time of the incident, Iran Ranasinghe alias SF Lokka has been heading towards Anuradhapura in a white-coloured motor vehicle, with the police saying that a woman was also in the vehicle with him at the time. Two unidentified assailants on a motorcycle had opened fire on SF Lokka and had murdered him. 8 rounds had been fired from a T-56 firearm, and the 30-year-old had been hit in the chest and neck. The gunfire had also led to the vehicle of SF Lokka catching fire.
එක් පුද්ගලයෙකුට වෙඩි ප්‍රහාර කීපයක් එල්ල වී තිබුණා. දකුණු ගෙල ප්‍රදේශයට සහ පපුව ප්‍රදේශයට. ඔහු රෝහලට ඇතුළත් කරන විට මිය ගොස් සිටියා. ගෙල ප්‍රදේශයට වෙඩි ප්‍රහාර 5කට වැඩියෙන් වැදී තිබුණු බව මට තිබුණු තුවාල වලින් කියන්න පුළුවන්. එල්ල වූ වෙඩි ප්‍රහාරවල මාරාන්තික ප්‍රහාර වැදුණු ස්ථානයේදීම යම් පුද්ගලෙක් මරණයට පත් කරන්න පුළුවන් ගණේ වෙඩි ප්‍රහාරවල තමයි එල්ල වී තිබුණේ.
The deceased was also the main suspect in the 2015 murder of karate champion Vasantha Soiza. On the 24th of October in 2015, a group of assailants in the excess of 20 entered the nightclub Soiza owned and hacked him to death. SF Lokka was subsequently arrested over the murder and was out on bail when he was murdered today. The Chief Magistrate of Anuradhapura has ordered the police to apprehend the two suspects who perpetrated the murder and produce them before court.
Now, circling back to the election, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa has expressed his gratitude towards the Sri Lankan public for the confidence they placed in the government by voting at the general election 2020. Taking to Twitter, the president said that he is glad of the 71% overall voter turnout at the election, which backs the confidence of all Sri Lankans in the government's efforts in tackling COVID-19. The head of state further pointed out that Sri Lanka was the first South Asian country to hold general elections amidst a global pandemic. Now, in other local stories, Sri Lanka's national debating team ended their run as runners-up at the World Debating Championship, which was held online this year due to the coronavirus pandemic. Now, according to team coach Kitmina Hevage, the Sri Lankan debating team, who had never gone past the knockout stages of the competition in the 15-year history of participation, cruised through on a mixture of mental preparedness and international exposure through several other online competitions due to the COVID-19 pandemic.
First-time finalists Sri Lanka ended up as the runners-up in the World Debating Championships on the 2nd of August. The Sri Lankan team, consisting of Shalem Sumandiran and Janul De Silva from Royal College Colombo, Jasmine Markandu and Rahul De Silva from Colombo International School, and Shanidu Ratnayaka from Ananda College, lost out to Canada in the finals. Team coach Kitmina Hevage spoke to First at 9 on the team's experience.
It's of course a very proud moment that Sri Lanka went as far as the grand final of the online World Schools Debating Championship. Sri Lanka had not gone further than the last 16 round in previous editions of the championship, and this I think showcased the talents of the team in particular, and I think they deserve all the plaudits that we've been getting in recent times. So Sri Lanka first participated in the championship only 15 years ago. So we are a relatively new but upcoming country in this circuit. And I think we were able to, over the rounds, beat several so-called favorites and former champions of the likes of England and so on in getting to the final. So it's both a moment of pride and as well as a moment of satisfaction to know that Sri Lanka is now amongst the best teams in the world.
Hevage also expanded on what the team did different this time around to enable them to reach the final for the first time.
In terms of what we did differently, I think two things. One is that we focused more on the mental health side of the team, and we made sure that or they were able to handle the pressures of a knockout round better. So in previous editions, Sri Lanka has unfortunately lost as soon as we qualify for the knockout round. We followed the same structures. They had the same attitude of controlling the controllable. So they only focused on their performance. They weren't worried about the result. Therefore, when their performance was at a top level, they got the result that they were due and were able to win and go to the next round. So I think that mentality was quite instrumental in getting through the knockout round.
Further, Hevage added that the other important factor in the team's success was its ability to participate in several other international debating competitions prior to the World Championships, which he added was not a reality previously due to the lack of funding and sponsorships for the Sri Lanka National Debating Council.
The second thing I think that helped us a lot was exposure at the international level. So Sri Lanka, this year's team, was able to participate in 3 tournaments before the World Championships. Usually Sri Lanka is unable to take part in many international tournaments because of resource constraints. So the Debaters Council doesn't have donors or sponsors right now. So we work with a very tight, small budget, and as a result we are unable to go to these international tournaments. Fortunately, a lot of tournaments were moved online, which meant that the costs of participation were extremely low, and therefore the national team was able to participate at these international tournaments, and we were in fact able to win the first international tournament that Sri Lanka had won in its history.
Now, taking a look at the country's latest COVID-19 situation, there were 13 recoveries from the virus within the last cycle. Now, that pushed Sri Lanka's total recoveries to 2,537. With that development, active cases in the country now stands at 290. In addition, the island's overall number of infections now stand at 2,838. Sri Lanka confirmed its first COVID-19 case back on the 11th of March. We will see you shortly. Bear with us. Now, Sri Lankan stocks meanwhile closed 0.39% lower today in a shortened trading day as the country went into parliamentary elections and investors waited on the sidelines awaiting the outcome. The all-share price index declined 20.37 points to close at 5,146.44. The S&P SL20 index of more liquid stocks closed 0.06% or 1.25 points down at 2,213.83. Market turnover for the day amounted to 603.84 million rupees, where 39 stocks gained and 85 stocks fell. Now, here's a brief report on today's market performance, followed by a currency update.
Today was a short trading session, only for about 1.5 hours or 90 minutes of trading from 11 to 12:30 p.m. mainly because of the election day. Despite being a very short trading session, we saw over 600 million of turnover taking place. However, overall market was more or less on a profit-taking mode amidst the election, where we saw a run over the last couple of days. Most of the investor interest was focused on John Keys Holdings and the banking sector counters, mainly the larger 3 banks. And also we saw some interest in the construction sector. Counters mainly led by Access Engineering. Then we saw interest in Lanka Volatile and also Tokyo Cement taking place. So with that, we were looking at slightly less retail participation compared to the last couple of days, mainly because of the election taking place today, where most investors were on a wait and see approach, and some of the investors that had already made sizable gains and were not willing to hold it beyond the election date were on a selling mode. So we saw some selling pressure coming in. With that, the SPI index dipped by around 20 points, and the S&P SL20 saw a dip of around 5 points. On the foreign front, again we saw net foreign outflow, and the amount was 164 million today.
The massive explosion which occurred in Lebanon's capital Beirut yesterday has killed at least 100 people, leaving thousands injured. 2 Sri Lankans have also sustained injuries during the incident. It has been confirmed that many of those killed in the mega explosion are port and custom employees and people working in the area or driving through during rush hour.
Lebanese rescue workers dug through rubble today, looking for survivors after a massive warehouse explosion sent a devastating blast wave across Beirut, killing at least 100 people and injuring nearly 4,000. The toll was expected to rise after the blast at port warehouses that stored highly explosive material. The explosion was the most powerful ever to rip through Beirut city, which is currently reeling from an economic meltdown and a surge in coronavirus infections. President Michael Aoun said 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate used in fertilizers and bombs had been stored for 6 years at the port without safety measures. An official source familiar with preliminary investigations blamed the incident on negligence. The intensity of the blast threw victims into the sea, and rescue teams are still trying to recover bodies. Many of those killed were ports and customs employees and people working in the area or driving through during rush hour. Facades of central Beirut buildings were ripped off, furniture sucked into streets and roads strewn with glass and debris. Further, cars near the port were flipped over. People walked around in shock, with helicopters overhead and teams searching for the missing at sea. In a separate development, the Sri Lankan embassy in Lebanon said that 2 Sri Lankans have sustained injuries from the explosion. Furthermore, minor damages occurred to the Sri Lankan embassy in Lebanon. However, none of the embassy officials have sustained injuries.
And that's it from all of us here at First at 9. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.